Hello and welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about Robert Koons' paper on teleology as higher order causation. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Koons with us today. So this is going to be a reading group session where there won't be any questions about what the author really meant. So Professor Koons works at the University of Texas at Austin. He specializes in metaphysics, the philosophy of physics, and the logic. And he's one of the main figures of contemporary neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. I'm going to give a short overview of his paper, and then I'm going to hand it over to him for further reflections, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. So our starting point is the observation that teleology is everywhere, if we look closely enough. For example, it offers the possibility of grounding the distinction between veridical and erroneous representation in the distinction between function and malfunction, between success and failure at carrying out the mind's natural functions. So teleology offers us a way to understand intentionality. It can also be used to ground epistemology. Rob here refers to Plantinga's book on warrant and proper function, which uses functions to define what knowledge is. It is also, teleology can also be relevant when it comes to the problem of qualia and personal identity. I hope we will come back to these during the Q&A. Now, the central concept of the paper is the concept of right functions. A state B occurs for the sake of state G on this conception if B tends to bring about G, and B occurs because it tends to bring about G. For example, the heart beats because its beating tends to bring it about that blood circulates. That what it means on this conception is to say that the function of the heart's beating is to circulate blood. Right functions can be intrinsic or extrinsic. So, for example, a bird's wing is having the function of assisting flying is an intrinsic function. The farmer feeding the cows in order to help them grow is an extrinsic function. And we can also distinguish productive and informational functions. We have productive functions when some actual production is going on. And we have informational functions where the question is more about transmitting information. For example, when it comes to the functions of the eye. Now, the problem with right functions as a definition of teleology is the following. Imagine a world in which a Nazi-like regime institutes a dysgenics program aimed at a hated minority race. A harmful mutation is introduced into the minority population that renders the bearer nearly blind and makes attempted seeing painful. The Nazi breeders gradually eliminate all of the members of the minority race without the gene by testing for signs of faulty and painful vision. In such a case, the defective gene appears to satisfy Wright's criterion, since part of the causal explanation of the presence of the gene in the population is the deleterious effect of the gene on the bearer's vision. Yet it would seem odd, at the very least, to say that the gene had the function, and not just the effect, of impairing vision. Or less dramatically, suppose that the presence of ice in a rock crevice causes the crevice to remain open. In this case, the existence of ice in the crevice is caused by the power of the ice to keep the crevice open. The ice has the Wrightian function of keeping the crevice open, which sounds wrong if right functions are meant to be teleological, because what we have here is, well, we don't really have real functions here. We just have blind mechanical forces in nature. And in place of right functions, the paper recommends moving to Aristotelian proper functions. Now, on this view, a state has the proper function G in some kind K if it has the right function. That is, the fact that K's have B is causally explained in part by the existence of a causal law linking B and K to G. The system of such functions in members of K forms a mostly harmonious, mutually supportive whole, and the BG function in question contributes to this harmony. The existence of K's is causally explained in part, at least in part, by the harmony mentioned in condition 2. Using Aristotelian proper function, one can define the Aristotelian good of an organism, or generally some entity is the successful exercise of its proper functions. So this is a somewhat lightweight notion of Aristotelian good. It doesn't require some heavyweight value theoretic commitments in metaphysics. All it requires is that we have a system of functions which is harmonious in some appropriate sense. There's a very interesting discussion of harmony in the paper. Various notions of harmony are distinguished. I'm going to skip this, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. And the central question is how to make sense of condition 2 in the definition of right functions, which is also part of the definition of Aristotelian proper functions, namely the condition that some state occurs because it tends to bring about some other state. One possible approach here is the retrospective one, where B occurs because past instances of B tended to bring about the goal in question. For example, on this view, the heart of contemporary humans have a function. It's have the function of circulating blood because our evolutionary ancestors developed organs that did circulate their blood. So the evolutionary prehistory of an organ or generally some state explains why that thing or state has a function. And Rob dismisses this idea pretty quickly, and I'm going to follow him now. But again, we can come back to this in the Q&A section. And then the second half, I like this paper because it is extremely rich. It indicates many different possible ways of looking at teleology, and it indicates how teleology can be used throughout metaphysics, and at the same time it contains a really hardcore logic part, which is the second half of the paper that we're coming to. We're working with situation theory, which is cool, and we're building all sorts of mariological and causal and modal notions into it. I certainly not going to try to go into the formal details here. What I'm going to try to do now is to unpack the resulting definition of right functions. I'll try to give a sort of informal reading of what this formula here means. So this formula is supposed to define a state B having the intrinsic purpose of G-ing in a certain situation relative to some background conditions. And at first pass, what the formula means is that state B has the function in question if the fact that some state token S star supports a causal modal constraint between V and B on the one hand and G on the other is causally relevant to S's being B. I changed the notation around a little bit to simplify it in the present context. Before we delve into the formal details, so there are basically two things to understand here: the blue relation and the red relation. The blue relation is the relation of causal relevance, and the red relation is the relation of causal modal constraint obtaining between state types. But before we look at the details, I'd like to indicate that this approach promises to solve the problem of mental causation in the following sense. Suppose that we are able to make sense of functions and teleological causations in this framework in such a way that the resulting causal relation is hyper-intentional. Namely, a state, namely an event, say a mental event, can have a certain function in this framework, the function of bringing about G or whatever, without some necessarily co-occurring states. Let's say the physical state that realizes the mental state in question also having that function. If you can work out a notion like that, then we pretty much solve the problem of mental causation, because we have made sense of the idea that mental states cause other mental states in this teleological fashion without the underlying realizing physical states also causing them. So a lot is at stake here. Now, onto the formal details. So we're going to look at the relation of causal relevance. First, in the case of higher order states, this obtains, so situation S is being B, a B-type situation is causally relevant with respect to situation S star as being G, if S is the smallest situation that is causally relevant with respect to S star at the token level. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. And the first state is B and the second is G. In the case of token situation, causal relevance is pretty much the same as the Inus conditions of Mackey. So S is causally relevant with respect to token situation S star. If S is an Inus cause of S star, S is a necessary but insufficient part of a contingent sufficient cause of S star. Our second correlation is the relation of a causal model constraint obtaining between situation types. A situation supports a causal model constraint between B and G if and only if at any world W that is possible from the standpoint of situation S, and for any S1 within that world, if S1 is B, then there is another part of the world in question, such that S1 is the immediate cause of this second situation, and the second situation is G. Now, informally, I'm going to try to summarize this by saying that in worlds accessible from S, every B is a direct cause or immediate cause of some G. Using these definitions, what results, as far as I can see from the formal condition concerning right functions, is that state B has the intrinsic purpose of G-ing in situation S. I left out the background condition for simplicity. If and only for any minimal Inus cause S star of some B situation, for all worlds accessible from S star, every B is a direct or immediate cause of some G. I'm going to stop now and hand it over to Rob. I have two questions. The first is this a mischaracterization of the core idea? And the second question is, if it isn't, then why isn't this definition easy to trivialize? So take, for example, suppose that B is the state of a lightning striking a tree, and G is the state of the tree catching fire. And let's take some minimal Inus cause of a lightning, let's say some atmospheric disturbance. It sounds plausible to say that in all worlds that are accessible from the situation of that disturbance, whenever a lightning strikes a tree, the tree catches fire. So it seems that that definition that I tried to assemble informally is satisfied in this case, but it doesn't seem to be true that atmospheric disturbances that cause lightnings, it doesn't seem true that trees, that lightning striking a tree has the intrinsic purpose of making the tree catch fire. So I don't see how simple nomological irregularities that uniformly occur from the standpoint of a given situation, how they won't trivialize this sort of definition, but I'm sure that I'm missing something.
Great, no, excellent job, Danny, appreciate that. And so my answer to the first question is no, that it's not a mischaracterization. You did a really fine job of summarizing the view. So yeah, maybe I should pick up the second question first. That might be helpful in understanding the view. So, of course, first of all, remember, this is just a definition of right functions, so we still have to add the harmony condition to get true biological function into the story. So that will be relevant, I think. But even before we get to that, I think that actually your example of the lightning wouldn't count as a right function either. So it's already going to be ruled out by the simple account here. So in this case, for the trees, let's say, well, so I guess a question here is what's the B going to be? So is the idea that lightning is supposed to have a particular function, or is it that a tree's flammability is supposed to have a certain function, right? So we'd have to sort that out first. So if it were lightning, right? If lightning were the B, right? Then the right function formula would say that the lightning's tendency to cause trees to ignite is causally relevant to the existence of lightning, right? And I don't think it is, as far as I can tell, right? Lightning existed before there were trees, right? Really independent of trees existing altogether, and so certainly independent of their being ignited by lightning. So right away, lightning won't have that kind of function, certainly. Now, suppose we've talked about the proneness of trees to be ignited by lightning, right? Is in other words, the flammability of a tree, does that have the function of being ignited by lightning, let's say, right? So here, this is more complicated, right? But here, I mean, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think it's no. That is, the question would be, is the fact that the tree has a certain kind of composition, let's call that B, the fact that that is causally related to igniting if hit by lightning, let's say, that'll be the G in this case, right? Is that causally relevant to the existence of trees? Is part of the explanation of why we have trees the fact that they are in fact ignitable by lightning? Again, I don't think so. I don't see any way in which that contributes to the or is relevant to the explanation of trees. Let's suppose we give some sort of Darwinian explanation for the origin of trees. So there'll be various features there that nature has selected for. I don't think nature is selected for its flammability by lightning, as far as I know. Now, if it turned out that it had, right, that that's actually part of the, maybe they're kind of tree that actually successfully reproduces itself only by being hit by lightning and scattering the seeds in such a way that the tree species is perpetuated. If that were the case, then indeed that would be a function of the tree's composition. It would have the function of being ignited by lightning. We could sort of say why. Well, the tree has to be hit by lightning. It's important in order to scatter the seeds that will then lead to the next generation of trees. So in that case, we would actually get the right answer, I think, in terms of the right function. So that would be, I hope that helps a little bit, the explanation. Now, what's really interesting, I think, and the paper doesn't really spell this out in great detail, is, how does this sort of thing work, right? How is it that a causal constraint could be causally relevant to the existence of a certain kind of thing, right? In general, right? And so I think what I intended in the paper was that, of course, a kind of Millikan story where this happens through natural selection is one way in which that could happen, right? So indeed, it could be that because past instances instantiated this causal connection, that fact is relevant to the evolutionary story that gives us the thing in question today. But I didn't want that to be part of the very definition of function. So I wanted to allow there to be other ways in which this right type connection could occur, right? So for instance, I think if you think about artifacts, and suppose it's a sort of one-off artifact, right? So in other words, I sit down and I'm very smart and I build a robot that will drive a car, let's say, right? And it's got some component that swerves when it detects, a living thing, let's say. Now, does the car have that feature? Is the fact that this new car has that feature causally relevant to the existence of the car? And I would say yes, because the designer wouldn't have built the car at all had it not incorporated this feature, which has this particularly causally relevant connection. So the designer actually knows about the causal connection, let's say, and in light of that knowledge, builds the car a certain way. All right, so that would also satisfy the definition, the Wrightian definition, without any natural selection being involved, right? A different way in which the causal connection could be relevant to this particular case. And just one more thing on this point. This is actually why I use situation theory. And it was partly, of course, because I was very interested in the time and working with Barwise and others. But I thought that it was very helpful in giving an explanation for how a sort of modal fact, right, could be causally relevant to a concrete fact? Because that's otherwise a sort of puzzling thing, right? Because you might think that the modal fact is going to be, it might be metaphysically necessary or necessary in all the nearby worlds. And so then how can we think about it in terms of its causal relevance? And here's where situation theory I think is very helpful. And this connects with the Mackey-Innes condition as well. It enables us to make sense of Mackey's-Innes condition, actually, which is what does it mean to be a part of a larger situation? Well, that's exactly what situation theory is all about, right? That there are facts which are sort of parts of larger facts. Right? And so now instead of asking, is there a world where this causal constraint doesn't hold and what goes on there, which is the sort of standard approach, or to somehow find a population in which the causal constraint doesn't hold in the real world and see what happens there. The situation theory says, we just delete the causal constraint from actual situations. And we ask, is what's left sufficient to support a different effect, let's say, or the effect that actually occurs? And the answer in many cases would be no, right? So the situation theory enables you to talk about things like causal laws, let's say, themselves having effects, right? Because were they deleted from relevant situations, you wouldn't get the effects that you see. And in my book about 2000, a couple of years later, Realism Regained, I use this to explain how things like mathematical necessities could be causally relevant. Because again, you can kind of delete certain mathematical facts from a situation and look to see whether what's left is enough, gives you enough to get the particular effect. And that again is something very puzzling to folks who think that how could a mathematical necessity be causally relevant? Situation theory was supposed to help with that. So that's yeah. And then I might just say something about my current views, right? So this paper was written 22 years ago. So I don't actually, I wouldn't endorse it 100%. Although I still think there's some interesting things in there, and I wouldn't renounce it either. But there's maybe two areas where I would make some changes now, or at least additions. One would be the paper is sort of tacitly physicalistic, I think, in a way, kind of assumes that all the basic types we're working with are physical types. And then the question is, how could those physical types have like biological functions? And I'm much more skeptical about whether that will work now. I think that that in fact, the things that have functions, biological functions, are mostly biological types, right? So in other words, it's having a wing that has the function of flying. And having a wing is not a physical type, right? It's an irreducibly biological type, I think. We get to talk about why I think that. I think that the notion that we can think of these biological types as sort of real patterns in Daniel Dennett's view fails, because Dennett's account of real patterns in this context would lead to a vicious circularity, because what makes something a real pattern is that it's recognizable by living things. And so again, you'd be back in kind of a vicious circle. So I think there are irreducibly biological types. And so then you might think, look, there's a simple answer here, or that may create some problems for my account. Because if I say, why do birds have wings? Why does a sparrow have wings? And the answer would be, because that's essential to being a sparrow. It's a formal relation rather than an efficient causal relationship, right? And so that might be a problem. Although I haven't really thought this through. One might be able to build some sort of notion of formal causation. Probably what we would need here was some sort of notion of grounding, right? Some kind of metaphysical explanation, which was completely lacking in this paper, and I think would be a helpful thing to add at that particular point. Another thought about this problem is one might be able to step back here. We might be able to say, well, yes, it doesn't really make sense to ask why sparrows have wings, because that's essential to being a sparrow. But we could ask, why do some vertebrates have wings? Why does the class of vertebrates have species that are winged? And then we might give a kind of right-like explanation that there are such species because the wings enable them to fly, and that, and yada, yada, yada. So I think one might be able to, work around that particular problem in a couple of different ways. The second thing is probably more fundamental, difference now is that the paper was really written in what we might think of as a kind of semi-Humean account of causation. It's what in another work I've called a Gnomist account of causation, the Dretske, Tooley, Armstrong kind of view that says that it's not totally Humean because it takes laws of nature to be fundamental things and then defines causation in terms of laws of nature. And my current view is that that really isn't the best way to go. It's better to think in terms of causal powers and think of laws of nature as kind of summaries of these causal powers. But then the whole problem looks quite different. And you might argue that teleology is not easy, right? Because something has a teleological function just in case it has a causal power, which manifests itself in this way. This is actually, I think was Aquinas' view, might have been Aristotle's view. It's a view that Michael Roda and Alex Pruss and others have written about. And I've actually adopted this view in a couple of my more recent papers as well. So now, from that point of view, the whole Wrightian approach is sort of misguided, right? Teleology is really all over the place because wherever there's causal powers, there's teleology. Right? Now, you still might say, okay, but maybe there's a special sense of teleology, right, which we use in the context of biology. And so maybe in some sense, water has the function of dissolving salt, because that's one of its causal powers. But really, that's not function in a narrower sense of like wings and eyes and so on. And so then you might be able to argue that that there's some slightly richer notion of function that the paper is aiming at as its target. But that again would be an interesting question, really, whether you actually need such a more specialized, narrow thing, or whether it's just a, here's an interesting thing about some functions, right? They occur in harmonious systems, they satisfy Wrightian conditions. That's sort of interesting, but it's not definitive of what it is to be a function. So those would be kind of a couple points where I might now want to back and fill a little bit.
Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. That really filled out the background for me and helped me understand the aims of the paper and even the structure better. And it's very interesting the way your views changed. I have many potential questions, but I'd like to open up for Q&A now.
So thank you again, Professor Koons, for coming. And I have a concern about the harmony constraint in your paper. You say that something in order to be a function has to contribute to the harmony of a thing, and it has to function like in that thing that makes it a mostly harmonious whole. And I just had a thought experiment pop up in my mind that, there could be people whose bodies start to grow spontaneously a new body part, like a wing, like in mutants in certain movies. And this doesn't contribute to the existence of the person. It doesn't contribute to the existence of our species. And this very thing might be such that it causes a lot of pain and stress and problems for this person. So it doesn't seem that it contributes to the harmony of the whole, that is the body of this person. So, but still, it seems if there is teleology, then a fully complex wing that could grow out from a person's body and could help the agent to fly does have a function. If teleology exists, then this is an example of it. So I don't know if it's really disruptive of the body, but it still has some kind of function. Then how does this fit with the harmony constraint of the view expressed in the paper?
Yeah, interesting. No, that's great. That's a great question. Really interesting thought experiment. Right. So the wing actually enables the person to fly, but in toto, right, it doesn't contribute to the overall harmony. It actually detracts from the harmony of the person's life, right? Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, as you gave the example, I was immediately thinking about things like tumors, right? Where,
Yep.
you know, that's basically what happens, right? Cells in the body sort of spontaneously start doing something. And we ordinarily wouldn't think, right, that was a function of the organism as a whole, right? That it have this tumor, right? There might some things that the tumor is doing might be functional for the tumor, right? But not for the whole person. Mm-hmm. So you're sort of imagining a case where the tumor sort of accidentally, you might say, does something interesting, right? And some of what it does might even contribute to the survival and reproduction of the organism. Your question is whether that would count as a function. I mean, I guess my initial reaction is to think that no, it wouldn't really be a function of the person. It would just be something that accidentally did something, right? That was maybe even in some respects advantageous, but doesn't really have that as its telos in this particular case. Let's see if I can try to think of another sort of example. I mean, you know, I could use the old, I think it's an example from Voltaire, right? Whether noses exist for the sake of supporting glasses, right? And I mean, in fact, they do support glasses, right? And that may well have contributed to the survival of certain like nearsighted populations, right? As a result. Does that give it a function, or is it merely an accidental byproduct, so to speak, of the nose's real function, which is, you know, smelling and so on? Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to say that it isn't really a function in that case. Because, you know, the human beings as a whole are not here because noses support glasses. It's completely irrelevant, right? And so similarly, if you had human beings with these weird wings that appear, I mean, they're not really contributing to the existence of human beings, right? So there's certainly not functions that we have as human beings, certainly. And does the wing itself have a function somehow, maybe in its own right? Well, it doesn't seem like it does, because it kind of just seems like it sort of accidentally does this. I mean, maybe, I suppose here, this might make your case a little bit more compelling, actually. I mean, suppose it turns out that these wings involve, you know, reactivating some dormant genes within the human genome, right? That we inherited from, you know, reptilian ancestors that had wings or something like that, right? And so then you might think, well, okay, so now this wing clearly has a function, right? Because it's a product of genes which themselves are there because they produce wings that produce flight. Yeah, so that's interesting. So in that particular case, I wonder then if I could accommodate the wings function into this story. But you're right, the harmony thing is going to be a problem for me. In other words, you might be able to say, okay, it has kind of a right function, perhaps, of flying, but it's not really harmonious in human beings anymore, and that seems like a problem. Yeah, good. No, that's a good objection, actually. I'll have to think some more about if there's any way to work around that. Maybe the fact that it once was part of a harmonious whole and is a kind of vestige of that would be enough for it to have a function now. But yeah, that would require some revising of the account.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Would you agree that this issue might turn on the question whether accidental functions could exist? I mean, you seem to deny the whole idea that there could be accidental functions.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, well, the word function in English is sort of ambiguous, right? You can talk about something having a function where that's just, you know, something, a way that we can use the thing, right? So I could say that the stump in my backyard has the function of being like a seat because we sit on it, right? Mm-hmm. But that seems to be a pretty loose sense of function, right? I mean, there's nothing, again, there's no teleology there, right?
Sure.
In the case of the stump's role as a seat. And so likewise, I think I might question whether there's a teleology here to the wings enabling flight in this naturally flightless, you know, organism. Mm-hmm. Especially if especially when it's not harmonious, right? Because if it fit into a new harmonious whole, you could just say, well, a whole new species, right? And in the context of that species, clearly it has the function of enabling flight. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, let's say, so maybe again, I suppose I'll have to think a bit more about what harmony means here, right? So if the wings are such that as a whole, they make the human being, let's say, less fit, so they're less able to survive and reproduce as a whole, but still they have some aspect which is actually good, which is contributing to survival. Is that enough to give the wing a teleological function of contributing to flight? Yeah, that's interesting. I have to admit, I feel some pull in your direction, right? And it makes me wonder whether maybe there's some kind of tweaking of the harmony condition that might be helpful here. I mean, it is at least partly harmonious, right? In the sense that something that the wing is doing is enabling me to improve my fitness. But, you know, it also has other consequences that are deleterious. Yeah, it's a good question. Good challenge.
May I also have a broader question that you might answer shortly if you like? I was thinking whether this harmony condition or the condition that the function has to contribute to the good of the organism could be construed such that it would have some moral content, like, I don't know, the harmony of the soul of a person, or the psyche of a person, or the harmony of society could be served by these functions. Do you think it could be used in that way or not?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, all that's sort of in my background of my mind when I'm writing this. You remember, I mean, Plato makes a big deal about this in the Republic, that you know, justice and the soul is a certain kind of harmony of the various parts, and he's really talking about the kind of teleological structure of the human personality, right? And Aristotle likewise. And both of them, of course, generalize that to the whole of human society, right? So a human society where is a good society, it's a prospering, thriving society when the various teleological functions are manifested successfully, right? Human beings are naturally social animals, right? And so we naturally cooperate harmoniously with other human beings in our polis. And that's a foundation for the very possibility of moral virtue in human beings, right? Why is justice a virtue in human beings? Well, because it's a capacity we have, natural capacity, with the teleological function of enabling sustained cooperation, right, among fellow human beings. So yeah, I think there definitely has a moral connection here. Yeah, and that was really in the back of my mind as I was working on this too.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you for the questions, Tamás. Next one in the queue is Martin.
Great. I really enjoyed the paper. In fact, it's been on my reading list for a long time. So the prompt to put it up to the top was really helpful. So I've got a reasonably small question, although I found lots of things kind of stimulating. And it's on the situation theory stuff. So towards the end of the paper, oh, in fact, in the conclusion, you say that one of the virtues of using situation theory here is there's some sort of explanation for the hyperintentionality in kind of teleological and cognitive contexts like this. And then I think from what you said earlier, which I think is about page 18, this comes about because we're not using a classical logic, but rather strong Kleene logic. And so formula which would be classically equivalent are not equivalent in the situation theory. And that's how you kind of get this kind of extra level of richness. And that made me wonder, well, and I haven't got an example here, but the hyperintentionality seems to me to be so robust that I wondered whether might be some formula which are equivalent according to strong Kleene type logics, but nevertheless we still want to keep apart. And if so, whether it might not be so much a matter of the logic being different, but rather, because some people do this in situation theory for other reasons, but if you've got a sufficiently kind of fine-grained notion of the content of the token situation, it might not go with the logical equivalence, no matter what the logic is, but it could be that, you know, just the facts, even though they're logically equivalent under whichever logic you're choosing, still are not going to be identified. And then you can kind of get even more richness that sort of overreaches the richness of the logical distinction. So I'm wondering kind of either now or when you wrote it, which of those you had in mind, and whether you think it's right that we should try and go for super extra fine grain, or whether you think actually there's some advantages in having a tie here between the kind of expressibility of the logic and the expressibility of the situation theory.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And Danny introduced this by saying that now we won't have to worry about what the author meant, but in fact we do, because this was an author of 22 years ago, and I'm not entirely sure what he meant and had in mind at that stage. So yeah, let me see if I can wrap my mind around this really interesting question. One of the things that I was doing, I think, still was approaching these matters in a fairly nominalistic way, again, sort of implicitly. So I was really thinking of types as these types as, you know, resemblance classes or something like that, right? And so, as opposed to a more Platonistic or Aristotelian or other sorts of views. So I didn't have any talk about tropes or universals or anything like that going on in the paper. And so that does open up, you know, additional possibilities here, I think, of even greater intentionality than I was looking at. So within the kind of nominalistic constraints that I was working with, I do think there was some fairly tight connection between the intentionality of content and the underlying logic of the situation theory. So I was saying, look, even if you're a nominalist, really, you can get a lot of hyperintentionality if you do this sort of situation theoretic approach. I think that might help to answer the question. And of course, it's also true that once we get to something like complex symbols in the mind, you can start getting greater distinctions, right? So if I'm actually thinking something that in the mind is a kind of complex of P and Q, then you might even be able to distinguish that from Q and P, or P and Q, and various things, just because of the structure of the representation. So what I have in mind here more is the content of like simple symbols, so to speak, or simple representations in the mind. And pointing out that in this kind of context, you could still have things that are logically equivalent in classical logic and yet distinct in content, even at that very simple sort of basic level. And that might help with things like animal cognition and so as well. Yeah. Now, what I think would be interesting is whether, in the case of setting intentionality aside for a minute, right? Just thinking about causation and teleology, right? Do we there need any greater richness than the kind of situation theory logic gives us? And I've not run across anything yet, but you know, I'm open to that. But I haven't run across any cases where I'm really inclined to think, you know, that P and Q has a causal effect that P and Q couldn't have by itself, let's say, right? In other words, any finer distinction doesn't seem to me to make any causal difference. And I think that's probably true teleologically as well. So that would be my answer to that question, I think, so at this point.
Great, thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
I was interested at the beginning, the mention of qualia, and if there's time, I'd very much like to hear what the relevance of the work is to qualia, or how high order causation, in your view, relates to qualia, or is it part of what you were saying about mental causation?
Yeah, that was a point that I know that Danny mentioned, and as he mentioned, I thought, gee, I don't remember that in the paper.
Okay, fair enough.
And so this is another case where I've got to try to channel my 1998 version. I mean, it may be that one relevance here would have to do with again taking let's say an intentionalist view of qualia. And I know at the time I was thinking about, okay, colors, right? Are they, can I talk about them as really being there in the world and having some kind of causal power? And I think so, right? In the sense that the colors would be part of an animal organism's ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. And at that level, the fact that some berries are red, let's say, that might have the extrinsic function of signaling that they're edible by this organism, right? And we could give a sort of Wrightian explanation of that. And then you could describe qualia just in terms of, something in the mind having the function of representing that particular quality, that color, right? Okay. And so it'd be an attempt, this would be, again, sort of Aristotelian inspiration, right? I mean, qualia aren't things that just appear suddenly in the mind. They're rather, the representation of things in the world, right? So a way of kind of avoiding the dismissive or anti-realist approach to secondary qualities, right? That started with Descartes and Galileo and folks like that. Be take a more naive realist view in a way about colors. Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. That helps. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah, good. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I was going to ask the same question, but now I won't. But now let me go on to the second sort of throwaway line in the paper that you may or may not agree with now, which concerns personal identity. I thought that was also very interesting. How, that was also just a small remark, really. But I wonder, right? Can reconstruct your earlier? Yeah,
I'm trying to remember how that went. Right. So let me see if I can recall how this goes. I mean, the thought I think is that insofar as we can give an account of biological properties, right? Which I think, and you need to do teleology to do that, right? I mean, biological properties are teleological, I think, all the way down. So insofar as we can give an account of that, we can then approach personal identity from a kind of animalist, perspective, right? So why am I the same person I was yesterday? Well, because I'm the same organism, right? Why I'm the same organism? Well, because the whole point of these adaptations is to enable me to survive, right, and to reproduce myself. And so there's a biological continuity there, right, and a biological sense in which the organism as unit, right, plays a kind of critical role in these teleological accounts, right? It's, the point of these things is to reproduce organisms of a certain kind, right? And so, and those organisms, again, are unified diachronically by processes that are themselves teleologically unified, right? So something along those lines, I think, is what I had in mind. I can't remember if I talked about this. Like I said, in 2000, I published a book where I expanded a lot of these ideas that Realism gained. And think I may have talked about it, personal identity there a bit along those lines.
I'll check it out. I remember that book. It's very, very exciting. I remember reading it as a graduate student. I found it super dense.
Yes. Yeah, that was I sort of realized at that point that being that dense is maybe counterproductive at a certain point. So, yeah.
Thank you for the point on personal identity. It reminded me of some recent work in experimental philosophy on persistence. Some people argue, I think David Rose did, that people have, the folk has a teleological view of persistence. For example, he ran the Ship of Theseus puzzle by smuggling in certain teleological information. For example, that the ship that's composed of the old planks performs its original function better than the new one, and people tended to judge that it's then the old planks boat is then the original one. Whereas if the new one performed the function better, then they thought that that is the one that's identical to the original ship. So maybe one can develop this into an account of a personal identity as well. I'd like to ask you about your newer views as well, where teleology is related to causal powers. So you mentioned the worry that on this view, if salt has the power of dissolving or disposition of dissolving in water, then it will be the function of salt to dissolve in water, and that sounds strange. I have a slightly different worry. My worry is that all of the conditionals that we normally use to characterize dispositions, such as if you put salt in water, it will dissolve, are ceteris paribus. So salt only dissolves in water under certain conditions. For example, if the water is not already oversaturated with salt or something like that. So in order to describe the complete causal profile of a disposition, what you will need to do is to specify every single thing that it can do in any specific situation. So in any possible situation, you can put the salt in or put the salt into water. It will either dissolve or not dissolve or do something in between. And so you will end up with this very complicated function that links possible, very richly described possible situations with the specific outcomes. And at that point, it's not clear to me why the function of salt would be to dissolve as opposed to not dissolve if the situation happens to be such that it doesn't dissolve. So in what sense is its goal to dissolve as opposed to doing all those things that it can do, at which point this notion of teleology seems to collapse into the notion of doing something according to causal laws or something like that.
Right. Yeah, right. So I think the newer view relies very heavily on the idea that there are certain causal powers or dispositions that are metaphysically fundamental, and those are such, and they still may in a way be ceteris paribus in the sense that a causal power might be blockable or neutralizable or overwhelmable in various contexts. But the thought is that you can still, once you get down to these metaphysically fundamental powers, let's say, they will have a well-defined manifestation, right? And so they could be thought of then as ordered to those manifestations as their telos, right? So it wouldn't be so much that, right? So the question is, what are the metaphysically fundamental features of salt? Well, who knows, right? I mean, that we have to ask the chemist that, right? And it may turn out that, well, okay, dissolving in water is not really a metaphysically fundamental property. It's rather interacting with other molecules in certain ways, right? Or having certain, I mean, my own view on this now is that you do have fundamental powers at non-physical levels, at chemical and at biological levels, right? And so we would have to ask the sort of quantum chemist, what are the fundamental features, fundamental powers here of water and salt? That would give us a natural teleology for those substances, even if in certain cases those powers could be neutralized or blocked by other powers, right? But there'd be a distinction between the case where the power manifests, right, and cases where it doesn't manifest. Then we'd always have to have an explanation as to why it didn't manifest in this particular case, right? Whereas you don't need some special explanation for why it manifests. That's just a fundamental sort of thing. So the thought, so this, as I said, this connects with my earlier thought, which is, if you think that biological types and properties are irreducible, then I want to say the world includes sort of fundamental biological powers, things like perception, for instance. They're enabled by various chemical and even physical processes that underlie it, but in terms of metaphysical priority, it's the opposite of what a microphysicalist would think. That is, the powers of the chemical things in this context are actually grounded in the biological powers of the whole organism, and not vice versa. And so among my basic powers, right, is a power to perceive red things, let's say, when they're presented to me, and at least in proper illumination or something like that. And so that's a proper function of that power of me, and given that I have that as a fundamental power. So that's kind of a sketch of the approach. There is this paper that Alex Pruss and I, a chapter actually, Alex Pruss and I wrote about functionalism in the Jonathan Jacobs collection on causal powers. And that's where we sort of fill this in a little more detail, arguing that if you're going to be a functionalist about the mind, you really should do it in this causal powers kind of context. And that gives you a certain teleology for free, so to speak, along for the ride. So yeah, I think that's probably my preferred view. And as I said, I mean, that doesn't mean that everything I have in this chapter, this particular paper, is now useless, but rather it would be, I think, characterizing a particular interesting class of functions of teleology, rather than trying to define the essence of it in general.
Again, I'd like to push you a little bit on this, if you don't mind. So the basic idea is that, according to your current self, is that teleology is pretty much everywhere, right? And teleology is absolutely non-spooky. So there's nothing to worry about in terms of naturalism when we talk about teleology, and really every scientist is a teleologist without knowing it, because to the extent that they are investigating the dispositions of powers of various natural kinds, they are investigating forms of teleology. So is that the basic claim?
That's the idea. That's right. So I mean, negatively charged things, right? They have the power to repel other negatively charged things, right? So, two electrons repel each other, they're moving apart, they're performing a function. Their telos is acceleration away from each other, and that's just a manifestation of this underlying power.
Yeah, great. We have a question by Martin.
So again, this is a kind of another specific question. One of the things I really liked about their structure was that it seemed like it made a really natural distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic purpose, which seems like a pretty cool thing to do. And then kind of looking back at it, I was wondering about whether these were supposed to be exclusive. So is it, because what it seemed like, unless I'm getting something wrong, which is pretty, not unlikely, is that there could be cases where, the wings have the intrinsic purpose of flying, but also meet the conditions for there being an extrinsic purpose too. in the relevant sort of context. But that, I'm not sure that's a problem, but I'm kind of, normally when we hear intrinsic, extrinsic, I automatically go into exclusive mode. But it seemed to me that from this definition, kind of, it looked like you could have both at once. But again, I'm not saying that's problematic, but maybe just a little bit surprising.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the fact that seeds have nutrients, built into them in various forms, right? That has an intrinsic function for the plant because it helps the germinating plant to get going, right, with those nutrients. But it also has an extrinsic function for the animals that are eating the fruit, right? So it nourishes them as well. So the very same feature could have both kinds of functions.
So that sounds okay, but I'm wondering whether something could have an intrinsic and extrinsic function with respect to the same thing.
Okay.
Maybe that wouldn't be something that would be sustained by the definitions given, but I guess it wasn't completely clear to me why.
Yeah, good. Let me see if I can find.
It's section 7.2, page 23, I think. This is where the the applications come.
Right, exactly. So
I was kind of running the bird and wings example, but it seemed like the existence of wings presumably does have is causally relevant to there being birds, because they wouldn't be able to eat. If suppose they eat food that's up in the air, like they kind of eat fruit off the tree rather than seed on the ground, then there wouldn't be any birds if they couldn't fly. And that seemed to fit the description below of the seeds and the fulfilling of the nutritional needs. But I might be missing something.
I mean, I was assuming here that the phi, that the thing that has the function, was a feature of something other than the bird, right? Whereas if the new is, let's see. Well, I think that's what. Anyway, I'm not sure if I got it quite right here in 7.2. Actually, as I look at it, but what I had in mind, I think, was that when you have a feature of one kind of organism, right, which contributes to the survival of another kind, and which is such that that causal connection in the environment, right, is contributing to the existence of the second kind of organism, then that counts as an extrinsic feature of that environmental connection, right? Whereas when it's internal to the creature, so it's the creature itself which produces some result, right? And by doing so contributes to its own existence, that counts as an intrinsic purpose. So from that point of view, it would be exclusive, I think, right? It would be defined in terms of whether we're talking about the same organism or another. Now, what would be a tough case, maybe a case where there would be an overlap, would be things like, well, that would be harder anyway, would be things like symbiotic relationships, right? Where the environment is sort of internal to the organism, like the role of bacteria in my gut, for instance. But even there, it does seem to me that I'd want to say that that's extrinsic, because it does seem to be pretty clearly that the bacteria there are distinct organisms, right? And so whatever they're doing would be extrinsic to me, even if they're spatially contained by me in some sense.
I mean, that all sounds correct to me, but I think that's not the way I took 7.2 to be going. I thought in 7.2 it was supposed to be a claim that there's a structural dissimilarity between the two that allows for the distinction. The structural dissimilarity being the causal dependence in the intrinsic case is on the situations being a case of phi, whereas in the extrinsic case was on the situations being a case of nu. And because that's what I understood you to be saying there, it seemed like you could get the relevant dependence in an intrinsic case too.
Yeah.
And then it seemed to be both intrinsic and extrinsic, which again, I'm not sure that's like a devastating problem. But maybe if you, so I don't think you say it in that section, maybe it's elsewhere and I've kind of forgotten, but I don't think you draw the distinction the way you just have about the relevant entity being internal to that thing, which all sounds right, but also then you lose some of the virtue of being able to give this kind of formal distinction between them that doesn't rely on using words like internal to the organism, which is going to get you the right result, but isn't going to be that exciting compared to completely independent characterization of the distinction.
Yeah. No, good. I think you're right. So I probably was misrepresenting myself there, my earlier self. So I don't think I was giving that answer that I just gave. And as I look at it in more detail, but now I'm wondering, if really, well, certainly you're right. I mean, as I've given it in 7.2, they're not going to be exclusive. And in fact, started to wonder whether the so-called extrinsic purpose will just be a sub-case of the intrinsic, actually, or vice versa. Right? They make them. I have to think about that some more. Because as you say, I mean, if so, the wings contributing to flight explains the existence of birds. I think that's right, but it also explains the existence of wings. Right? And so that second point would make it an extrinsic purpose, right? According to my definition. And that's sort of odd, maybe, but maybe not.
But it also sounds kind of right to me that maybe that does at least partly explain the existence of birds, the fact that they have wings. Or at least these types of birds, these types of flying birds that eat things that they can only get to by flying.
Right. Yeah, that may be right. Yeah. Right.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is maybe a bit of a way out question, and I may have misunderstood something about the details of your account of higher order causation in terms of situation theory. And this isn't an objection, it's a genuine question. As far as I can tell, you sort of go up one level in terms of order. So you have a modal causal relationship being, so to speak, the cause of something like the presence of wings or something like that. Does that very higher order causation itself, can that appear in a sort of second order level of higher order causation, where that teleological relationship itself can be a cause of something? And so on, it could. Power of meta levels.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I'm trying to remember now if I exploit that in the 2000 book at all. I think I do, in fact.
Oh, okay.
So right. So for instance, I could have, maybe I have a capacity for recognizing teleology in nature, right? That would be a case where the teleological connection itself would be embedded in one of these other kinds of connections, which then affects, contributes to the existence of my faculty, right? So at least in principle, certainly, it could be.
And is that formally accounted for? In other words, if you just churn the handle you've already got, that just drops out, or do you need more formal machinery to get that to work right, do you think? Or it's already in there?
I think it just falls out of the machinery that's there already.
Okay,
so.
Great. Yeah, thanks, very interesting.
I was just going to say, in other words, there's nothing in the form of machinery that requires that such a thing happen, right? But so it'd be sort of an empirical question whether it does, whether there are powers of that kind. but the machinery allows for it and can accommodate it easily.
I have a sort of lightweight, very speculative question to your later self, the powers view of teleology. So if Aristotelian teleology is really about causal powers, why do you think Aristotelianism is often portrayed as a sort of antithesis of modern science? So what is, I mean, of course, there is the fact that he had his own biology, which doesn't match up with ours. But I mean, the spirit of Aristotelianism is generally taken to be somehow contrary to standard modern physicalism or what have you. Where do you think that tension comes from?
I think, well, a lot of the early modern people, I mean, not all of them, but Galileo, Descartes, Newton, that sort of stream, were actually very dismissive of power talk as well, right? I mean, remember the Moliere, right? Normative virtue, kind of thing. That was very much in the air. That was very much part of the revolution. And so the idea was exactly to replace causal powers with laws of nature, where those were just sort of mathematical functions that could be describing the motions of matter. And so from that perspective, you didn't really need to talk about modality, right? I mean, it was just the actual world. Any possible world was merely a kind of thought experiment or some sort of a fiction. It wasn't part of the world, as it had been for Aristotle. Right? And my own view is that it's really I mean, you could make the case that already thermodynamics sort of forced a view of powers back into the picture, but certainly the quantum revolution of 100 years ago or so, I think demonstrated the fact that you had to talk about potentiality again, which I think it was Heisenberg actually recognizes this in his little book on physics and philosophy. He said, wow, what we did was we revived potentia from Aristotle. And I think that's right. So there was a kind of revolution against powers of potentiality in a sense. And it was very successful for quite a while, but then ran up against the fact that there were these facts, even at the most basic physical level, that couldn't be explained without reintroducing some notion of powers, I think. Now, of course, even today, there are folks who would resist that, right? And there's sort of Bohmians, I think, who want to say there are no powers, they're just matter moving around according to some, wave function, Gaia pilot wave, right? Or the many worlds view, I think, is in a way, an attempt to avoid powers as well, because you have no potentiality, you just have lots and lots of actuality, right? More than you ever expected. And I think those are both dead ends myself. I think that you actually do need potentiality back in the picture again. So that's why. So I think there was indeed a hostility to powers themselves, and that's connected with the dismissal of teleology as well.
It's a very, very interesting thought. How is thermodynamics relevant in this shift?
Yeah, because you have to, I mean, if you take things like entropy really seriously, right, you really have to have a representation of all the different possible states of the system, and you have to think of that as sort of physically real, right, as playing an explanatory role, not just as a thought experiment, but as something more fundamental, I think. I mean, again, there was and I think even today, probably most physicists would say, thermodynamics isn't really fundamental, right? It's just some Boltzmannian statistical, quirk or whatever. And I think that's absolutely wrong myself. But yeah, from that point of view, the thermodynamic story would again just be a kind of thought experiment. Wouldn't really be something fundamental.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we're nearing the end of the seminar. If anyone has final questions, please ask them now. I have a follow-up on your contemporary version of Aristotelianism based on causal powers and the teleology that characterizes them. Is that still a form of dualism, in your view? Or is it more like some emergentist, multi-level, something like that type of view?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like either of those terms, either dualism or emergentism.
Right.
I mean, emergentism seems to me to be still too physicalistic in a sense, right? So the new stuff sort of emerges from the physical. My own view is almost a demergentist view, right? That is, physics is kind of demerges from, if that's such a word, or emerges from, or something, the more fundamental chemical, thermodynamical, biological kind of level. So I don't think it's dualist at all, right? There's no interaction problem, and no sort of vital force or anything like that in the picture. There is downward causation, though, in a big way, from wholes to parts. My more recent work, again, I rely pretty heavily on grounding kind of talk. So the parts have powers by virtue of their participating in some whole in particular cases.
So it's not based on bottom-up explanation. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, based on a number of different things, right? Based on the idea that we want biological explanations to be real explanations, right? Not just some kind of a fiction. And then also thinking about the measurement problem in quantum theory. I'm very attracted by some recent work by George Ellis and Barbara Drossel and others, which are called contextual emergence. They use emergence, but I'll let them pass on this theory where it's the sort of macroscopic environment that's responsible for collapsing the quantum wave of an individual system. And that really requires these macroscopic things in the environment to be themselves more than just quantum systems, right? Or else you'd have a kind of contradiction. So you have to think of them as Aristotelian substances, right? My view now is that quantum phenomena are always manifestations of powers of larger chemical or thermal substances. I've been calling them in recent work.
Thank you very much. If there are no other last questions, then I'm going to thank Professor Koons for his time. This was an extremely rich and interesting discussion. So thanks again, and hope we'll see you sometime next year as well.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the questions and the comments. Thank you.